Good morning. If you don't like change, you're actually in pretty good company. Most people on the planet don't like change, and there's a reason for this. Most people don't like change because we work really well with homeostasis. Our temperature stays within 1 degree, okay, or a couple of degrees of a very specific temperature. We stay very, very close to that, okay? Our if you think about your relationships, you typically want stable relationships, right? When you've got chaos in your relationships, I mean, it might be a little bit exciting, but it's not. It doesn't bring you contentment long term, right? Having a new intimate relationship every week, it doesn't bring contentment long term, generally speaking, as far as I understand. So if we love homeostasis, it makes sense that we don't want change. If change goes outside of those parameters, homeostasis means you stay within the lines, right? The upper and lower lines where we're comfortable. If it makes sense, then how do we change? There are really only two ways. There are really only two reasons anybody changes in significant ways. We can make changes in small ways, okay? But in significant ways, there are only two ways. The first way is by fostering internal motivation. The second way is crisis. Think about the last few crises, either on a world stage or in a country or even in your family and relationships or business or whatever. When we have a crisis, economic downturn, whatever it is, when we have a crisis, guess what happens? We take action. But do you really want to wait for a crisis every single time? Do you really want to wait to be broke before you start investing money? Do you really want to have a broken relationship before you figure out how to listen better to people or engage better with people? Do you really want to fail to that degree before you learn your lesson? My guess is that that's not the case. I've worked with a lot of people who need failure typically to start to make change. I used to work in the field of addictions and mental health. And in addictions, this is the way addictions work, that people generally don't see the need to stop doing whatever they're doing, their behavior, until they've lost something significant. And my heart breaks when that happens. That's not the ideal. So let's talk about the first method I mentioned. The first method I mentioned is fostering an internal motivation. How do you foster internal motivation? It's actually quite simple. Not always easy, although it's not all that hard either. It's actually quite easy. It's extremely simple. And that is become obsessed with something. That's it. Is that not a letdown for today's session? Become obsessed with something. I'll explain a little bit more. Become obsessed with something. Think about the people who have achieved a lot of success in any way, who've had to make changes, who have gone through hard times, who have made sacrifices. We raise these people up on pedestals and we say these people were amazing in the world because they took all these actions and they overcame all these things. Well, guess what? Most of them did have crisis in their lives at different times, but the most successful people also usually have an ability to motivate themselves because they became obsessed with something. Either that is going to the moon for an astronaut, or it is succeeding in business to a certain degree, or it is working at a relationship until it works for you and the other person in this intimate relationship. If you become obsessed with something, what I mean by that is focus on it so much of the time with such intensity that it completely overtakes what you think about on a consistent basis. Your subconscious mind consistently thinks about this. When you become obsessed with something, that's when you will have an internal motivation. When you have internal motivation, you don't need the crisis anymore. Because you're focused on it so much, you'll take consistent action towards that. Because you're taking consistent action, you don't have to go through the big failures, the big dips, in order to achieve that success. Recently, my son said he was obsessed with dragons or something like that, or obsessed with Minecraft maybe. And my dad said obsessions aren't good. He said this to my son, and my son came back and he said, "Papa said that obsessions aren't good." And I said, "Don't listen to your papa with things like that. He's a wonderful man. Don't get me wrong. He's a wonderful man, but." My father's never had a beautiful obsession that he's chased relentlessly. And he associates obsessions with like addictions. That's not what I was talking about. That's not what I want my son to focus on. I want my son to focus on an obsession, to build an obsession, to get used to creating obsessions in his life. And not for 5 minutes, for longer periods of time. If my son is obsessed with dragons, let him be obsessed with dragons. That might lead to a career in writing certain books, or becoming a famous artist, or whatever, okay? The fact is that when somebody becomes obsessed with something, when it's all they think about all the time, that's beautiful. We shouldn't take that away from them. Start fostering a focus for yourself, an obsession that leads you towards your goals. If you do that on a consistent basis, you won't need the crisis, which I highly recommend. Remember, you've got this.